Hey everyone, and welcome to our channel. Today we will discuss how the US military might has been bogged down by Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and armed groups. For the first time since the Cold War, particularly since the 1980s when the US armed forces were the strongest, they are now most vulnerable due to the sudden impact of geopolitical, industrial, economic, and social factors. Experts in the media have noted these issues with the American military throughout the years, but recent events have seen them unfolding simultaneously. The military staffing crisis has reached a historic low since last year. The previous 2 decades of war have led to a sharp decline in public trust in the U.S. military, with only 60% of respondents stating that they trust the American military. Gallup poll statistics are the lowest in over 2 decades. U.S. service members during this period have been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. Twice over a year, the U.S. Navy had opened its doors to individuals with low scores to meet its personnel recruitment goals. Former Chief of the Indo-Pacific Command of the U.S. Navy, INDOPACOM, Admiral Harry Harris, told the Senate Armed Services Committee in 2018 that American ships found themselves in an unfavorable position vis-a-vis China, with its ground-based ballistic missile that threatens our basing in the western Pacific Ocean. His successor, Admiral Phil Davidson, agreed 3 years later in 2021, discussing China's missile tests. These anti-ship ballistic missiles of medium range are capable of attacking aircraft carriers in the western Pacific Ocean, Davidson said of the DF-21D. The missile represents an extremely unorthodox anti-ship ballistic missile with a range of over 2,000 kilometers. Specifically designed against American carrier strike groups, the missile follows a ballistic trajectory, then re-enters the atmosphere, releasing warheads, possibly at hypersonic speeds, towards American naval vessels. Former U.S. Marine Corps officer Robert Haddock, who at the time was a senior fellow at the Mitchell Institute for Aerospace Studies, told Reuters in 2019 that this is a huge gap, adding, China's anti-ship missile capabilities exceed those of the United States in range, speed, and sensor performance. If the weapon capabilities weren't enough, logistics to sustain a protracted conflict are another obstacle. Assistant Commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps General Eric Smith called this capability gap a dirty little secret during a Stimson Center webinar. U.S. logistics are in a nascent stage, and they lack the means to sustain a prolonged conflict, whereas China can. We can't rely on big, heavy platforms that will be loaded with strategic transport 30 days before notification while we seek support. Force Design 2030 addresses the issue by relying on lighter, more mobile, and smaller forces, Smith said at the time. While a wargame in 2020 conducted by the RAND Corporation repeatedly ended in devastating defeats for the United States and Taiwan, another military game held by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in 2022 resulted in a victory for the United States and Taiwan. This was because it was determined that Chinese capabilities for conducting amphibious operations were insufficient compared to American capabilities to resist invasion. The latest warning came from former generals and commandants of the U.S. Marine Corps, who have opposed the doctrine of Force Design 2030 by former Commandant General David Berger over the past 2 years. The operational concept involves small groups of lightly armed Marine units, firing missiles and maneuvering across islands, conducting anti-ship missile strikes against Chinese vessels from friendly, Ally-controlled facilities in South China and East China Seas. Citing a report in the Wall Street Journal, the Daily Caller recounted how former U.S. Marine Corps commanders such as Generals Joe Dunford, Anthony Zinni, and Charles Krulak tried to convince Berger to reconsider his plan, which destroyed the structure of the service. It quotes retired Lieutenant Colonel Scott Moore, who said the war games were built on some undeniable assumptions that Marines could be stationed on remote Pacific islands with adequate rear support before Chinese forces seized the area. Experts also pointed to the recent attack by Iran-backed militants on a U.S. base in Jordan, resulting in the deaths of 3 American servicemen, as indicative of a greater vulnerability to well-entrenched non-state actors that the overwhelming conventional American military power either does not deter or cannot defeat. Experts attribute the military situation to foreign policy elements. Daniel DePetris of Defense Priorities said the strike that killed 3 U.S. troops was in Jordan, not Syria. However, the base that was struck also supported operations in Tanf. In other words, if we weren't in Tanf, American forces might not have been in the attack location in Jordan. Benjamin H. Friedman, Director of Defense Policy at Defense Priorities, speculated deeper, age-old flaws in Washington's policies in the Arab region. The militants who killed U.S. servicemen must be held accountable. But we must ask why U.S. forces were left exposed to the zone of repeated drone, rocket, and missile strikes in this area. What caused this predictable danger? There is no answer. The U.S. government exposed them to danger by executing a grim and senseless mission, Friedman said. Leading foreign affairs specialist Stephen Wertheim also noted that the U.S. lacks sufficient military presence in Western Asia to conduct wars with Iran-connected militias in Syria and Houthis in Yemen simultaneously while arming Israel. If the United States wants to continue waging wars in the Middle East, it should continue to deploy tens of thousands of troops to the Middle East. If not, it should not, he said. The Houthis also stand out as a rare non-state actor with significant conventional military potential. In Europe, neither NATO member states nor the United States possesses the defense, industrial, and material technical capabilities to wage a large-scale land war with Russia. The most significant indirect acknowledgement of such a situation has been their official statements that they do not want to fight Russia and then not directly participate in combat operations, limiting their involvement to arming Ukraine. Concerns about a Chinese attack on Taiwan in the event of a clash between Washington and Moscow in Europe primarily stem from its reluctance to have troops to conduct physical actions in Europe. The same concern influences its actions in other hotspots in the Indo-Pacific region and the Middle East. In other words, it believes that its adversaries, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and China, benefit from its participation in any of these theaters of military operations. Moreover, Russian involvement is also present in the Western Pacific theater of operations, considering that its eastern coast is part of the Far East of Northeast Asia. Today's U.S. military is not designed to fight wars against two major opponents simultaneously. If China attacks Taiwan, the United States will find it difficult to repel the attack while continuing to support Ukraine and Israel, the Foreign Policy article states. Andrew H. Michta, Senior Fellow and Director of the Scowcroft Strategic Initiative at the Atlantic Council of the United States, summed up the intersection and complex balance that the United States will have to maintain between Europe, the Middle East, and the western part of the Pacific Ocean in an article for Politico in October 2023. If Hezbollah now attacks as well, this will provide the United States and its allies with a significantly expanded theater of operations, once again straining military resources. At the same time, Taiwan appears to be an even more likely third sphere of conflict. China's People's Liberation Army Navy already numerically surpasses the U.S. Navy. In Europe, regardless of how long the conflict in Ukraine lasts, Russia is busy expanding its armored vehicle production and military equipment at home. Moscow understands the scale, and the Russian army can now fight and mobilize simultaneously to increase its ranks to 1.5 million. Do you think U.S. military is very stretched and less effective from the past? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this content, please subscribe to the channel and share and like the videos.